Today is August 1st, 2024, and this is William Michael, the Headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. As I work to continue to develop the curriculum and course offerings of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, one thing that I'm always conscious of is the amazing amount of content the amazing amount of high quality content that is available for Catholics to study in the 21st century. And when we look at all of the courses, we can say, oh, well, I'd like to study that, and I'd like to study that. Man, I'd also like to study that. And the volume of study really multiplies, and we may be left asking the question, how in the world are we supposed to actually study all of this stuff? How are we supposed to study this incredible quantity of material? And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit in this talk today. I'd like to talk about how to make progress in studies when there's such a great quantity of content. And this is a very important cultural issue. This isn't so much about tips and techniques for how to study in a certain way, or 5 quick ways to read history or anything like that. This is really a cultural challenge for Catholic men and women and young people growing up in the Catholic faith. When I had boarding school students here living and studying with me, I taught them an illustration of a jar and a bunch of balls, and the balls represented different interests and activities. And you can only fit 3 or 4 of the balls into the jar. And so you've got this pile of balls, all different colors and sizes, representing all different interests and activities. And the jar or container is limited in size. And so we've got to choose which of those balls we're going to put in the jar. And we have to choose which balls we're not going to put in the jar. And that's what determines our culture. What we choose to do and what we choose not to do determines our culture. What we choose to be good at, what we choose to be experts in, and what we choose to not be good at, what we choose to not be experts in, determines our culture. And in an age of almost forced multiculturalism, we're asked to pretend that every combination of balls in the jar is as good as any other combination, and this is objectively false. There are some interests and skills that are superior to others. Aristotle explains this in Ethics. There is a most excellent good. There is a most excellent end or pursuit, that for which all others exist and that which exists for its own sake. So there's a hierarchy of ends to be pursued, and this establishes a corresponding hierarchy of interests and skills. And I think it's safe to argue that a general rule is that we should always pursue the most excellent ends that we can. And that means that we must always pursue the most excellent interests and skills that we're able to obtain. And inasmuch as it lies within our power, it becomes our responsibility to choose to pursue the things that are most excellent, the things that are most noble. And we can read this taught in the New Testament by St. Paul. He says in Philippians chapter 4, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. He says to us with respect to spiritual gifts that we should seek the most excellent of the spiritual gifts. And so we see this call to excellence. Jesus said, wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And he tells us to set our treasure in heaven. So we can see that we're called, as we consider all of the different interests and skills that are before us, all of, I could say, the potential interests and skills, the arts and sciences available to us. There are some that are more excellent than others. And so we've got to make decisions about which balls we put in the jar and which we leave out of the jar. Now, when it comes to studies, what we see is that the jar really represents our time and energy. There's only so much that we can do. There's only so much time in the day. There's only so much energy in the day. And I think that people really fail to think enough about the limitation of our energy every day. I always say to my wife that I think one of the most important things that I've learned through the years is how to conserve energy, how to avoid wasting my energy, whether it's physical or mental or emotional, any kind of energy. We've got to be very careful that we don't waste energy on things that are not necessary. And we've got to be able to direct and invest all of our energy in those things which are most desirable. And that takes discipline, and that ultimately creates culture. Because the things that we do, the things that we spend time on, the things that we spend money on, the things that we spend our energy on, determine our culture. They determine what we are, what we do, what we're good at, what we're not good at. And we make those choices. So having that illustration of the container and the balls is a helpful way to think about life. And the reason why this is important is because when we talk about studies, we quickly see how limited our time and energy is. Now, when we consider our time and energy, we can look at it immediately and say, oh, well, there's only 24 hours in a day. There's only so much energy. We can only study for so many hours in one day. Well, then there's also duration. There's also time multiplied by days, multiplied by years. And if we're really going to make progress in studies, what we see needs to be done is we've got to work consistently, day by day, over a long, long period of time. And this is why we should make it our goal to be wise old men. We should make it our goal to be wise old men. Now, I don't know how I came to this thinking when I was 19 years old, but when I was 19 years old, 20 years old, really just getting started with my studies as I was working through my conversion as a young adult, one thing that was sort of included in my conversion was a desire to be a wise old man. Even though I was 20 years old, I was thinking about being an old man. I even, in college, and my wife will testify to this, I hung out with old men when I was in college. I didn't hang out with fellow college students. I mean, a few Christian friends. But I spent time with old men. There was one man in the college town I was in. There was a historical society. This was in New Jersey. in the area between Rutgers and Princeton universities, there was a historical society that did a lot of sort of early American historical events and activities, and they had an old bookstore, which was actually an old inn that George Washington probably had stayed in. This old building that they used to open up on Sunday afternoons and have a little bookstore in there and sell used books and raise money for the Historical Society. That's where I was on Sunday afternoons, hanging out with the old man and his wife, who were the leaders of that Historical Society, and they would invite Dania and I to their house, and I can remember just sitting with them, Dania and I sitting with this old couple out by their back gardens and just talking about their life, their interests, their pursuits. They were asking us about our studies and so on, and I was happy in the company of old people. I was embraced by a number of old professors. One professor who really became my mentor, who inspired me to get into education, Dr. Adam Skrupski, who was at Rutgers. He was an old man when I was studying at Rutgers, and he invited me to join him to attend conferences. There was one conference I remember, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I think it was. He invited me, paid for all my expenses to join him and go to a conference down in Virginia. Invited me to his house to meet his wife and just talk. Used to give me books that he had in his library, old books that he thought I would enjoy. And he noticed in my writing a real interest in study, that I wasn't fooling around. I really wanted to study and learn, and made himself available to me, invited me to his house to become a mentor to me. And I was happy with that old man. Some of my other professors, Dr. Thomas Figuera, to whom I owe my interest in classical studies, same kind of a thing, an old, experienced professor, classics professor, expert historian, who would call me on the phone and check in on me while I was in college. Older men who knew that I was interested in being a wise man. And I was an old soul at that time in my life, and I thought, I want to be, my vision for my life was that I want to be an old, wise man. And I think that that's what we need to commit to. We need to commit to becoming old, wise men who have spent 20, 30, 40, 50 years of their lives studying, and who at the end of their lives, when they're in their 70s, 80s, maybe even older, have this treasure of knowledge and learning and experience to offer to younger generations. We're not going to be wise now. We're not going to make significant progress in any short time. And rather than trying to figure out how to do that, I think we need to ask a different question, which is, how can I become a wise old man? That's really what the next generation needs. And it may not be our children's generation that we are able to serve, but it may be our children's children's generation. And whereas our children now should be learning from their grandparents or even our grandparents, because of our grandparents' neglect, because of a lack of that kind of experienced older wisdom, our children are going to struggle. And there's just not a whole lot we can do about that, because we can't give what we don't have. And it's not necessarily for us to give. It's supposed to be that older generation sharing what it's collected over the decades of its life. And we just don't have that. I know in my family, we don't have that. I'm the first Christian in my family. I'm the first to go to college in my family. We don't have older Christians in our family to advise or mentor our children. It's just us, and we're learning as we go without that direction or help from older, wiser parents and grandparents. So it's a goal where I think we can aim to change things culturally in our family histories, but I really don't think that it benefits our children. It's not a nuclear family benefit, it's more of an extended family benefit for the future. And this is one of the things I think Christians struggle with. I think it's common for Christians to imagine getting married and having children and then having this rich nuclear family life, just husband, wife, and children. But that's really not how it works. Biblically, that's not how the family works. It's about children, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, with the great-grandparents and grandparents actually having much of the most valuable contributions to make. And for many of us, we just don't have that. It's like being raised as spiritual or intellectual orphans. But it can be a goal for us to say, while that may be something I have to struggle with, that may be something that I lack or that my children lack, I'm going to work and make decisions over the next 30, 40, 50 years of my life so that my children's children don't have to live without access to wise elders. And I think that's really what Christian men and women need to commit to in this generation. We need to think about being valuable in our 60s and 70s and 80s, if God wills and we live. And using our time, making decisions, using our energy to invest in being wise old men. Now, I hear so much talk, especially on the internet, on social media, about being materially wealthy. All this talk about investing money and developing sources of income and all this kind of stuff, investing, all this Dave Ramsey, worldly wise man talk. But I really don't think that that's going to help our families as much as having wisdom. And I'm also not going off the other side and saying that men shouldn't be working. I'm simply saying that in addition to our necessary work, because lands and houses are from fathers, Proverbs says, to pretend that we don't owe our children material things is just foolishness. We bring them into the world. We're responsible to help them. But I'm talking later in life, our most valuable contributions are not going to be financial. They're going to be intellectual and spiritual. And we've got to do the work and make the decisions and make the sacrifices in order to make that possible. And when we look at the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and all of the studies available to Catholic adults, and we get anxious looking at it. I know I when I was younger, I would walk into the library as a young man and almost feel like I was going to have a panic attack, because I just thought of how much there is to learn and how difficult the work is, how slow the work is, and just how much there is. And as I would think about it, I would just say, how can I possibly be wise if I don't know this, or if I don't know that, or if I don't learn that subject? And I used to get this like feeling of anxiety as I walked through the libraries. The answer to that, I think, is just time. That in God's providence, we may have 30, 40, 50 years to make progress. And the goal is not to try to have and enjoy the fruits of that learning now, but it's to begin accumulating it, begin growing, begin developing wisdom so that when we're 70, 80 years old, we possess it and can share it. So that's the first thing I'd like to say about studies is remember this image of the container with the balls which represent different interests and activities. We can only put a few things into the container. We only have so much time and energy. And we've got to think about what those things are. Obviously, those things have to begin with our own spiritual life, what we must do to save our souls. And I gave a talk earlier, actually yesterday, about real catechesis, which I recommend you listen to if you haven't listened to it. So that would have been July 31st. A talk on real catechesis, which is the four aspects of a right response to the gospel, which is basically the means by which we're saved. That has to be our first priority. So we've got to believe what needs to be believed. We've got to worship God in a manner that God teaches us to worship Him, according to the 7 sacraments of the Church. We've got to live according to Christian moral teaching, and we've got to pray. So those things have to be the priority, because if we have those, really all things will work for our good. And if we don't have those, then, like Jesus says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So we've got to have those things as the priorities, and yet they're not burdensome. That's not a full-time job. Jesus teaches us his yoke is easy, his burden is light. What's actually required for us to be saved does not take 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to complete. It's actually very, very convenient for us, and Christ has made it so. We've got to make that a priority, nevertheless. And then we've got to work to provide materially for our families. St. Paul says, if any man doesn't provide for the member of his own household, he is worse than an unbeliever. So we've got to provide for our families, so we need to do responsible, profitable, temporal work in order to provide for the needs of our family. And as I said before, we choose to bring children into the world. It's quite an evil thing to do that and then not provide for them. I can imagine kids growing up and saying, well, I didn't choose to come into the world. I didn't choose to be born. I didn't choose to make myself. I was made because of my parents' choice to have children. And that's true to an extent. And I think about that all the time. And I think, man, if my children have to suffer any lack, any difficulty that's the result of my choosing to have children and start a family and so on, I can't allow my children's needs to become a source of suffering for them when I'm the cause of their existence in this world, humanly speaking. And I think about that all the time. It's true. My children did not ask to be born into this world. I caused them to be born, and I don't want them to have to suffer. So I need to provide for them and to do so generously. So that's a second, really, responsibility with respect to justice in providing for the needs of our children. And then beyond that, we've got a lot of time. And while many complain that they don't have much time, the fact that they know all the news headlines, know all the TV shows, movies, sports scores, read all kinds of books, magazines, look at websites, social media pages, videos, on and on and on, it proves that there actually is quite a lot of spare time in all of our lives. And when all of our necessary spiritual work is taken care of, when our necessary temporal work is taken care of, there's not much room left in the jar, as it were, and we've got to make sure that the last ball or 2 or 3 that goes into that jar is strategic and necessary. And I would say that the main ball that needs to go into that jar is study. So we have a life of prayer, work, and study. And outside of that, I just don't think that there's much time left for things. For example, there was all this hubbub this past week because the opening ceremonies of the Olympics had some sort of living scene where there were these gay and transgender people in a scene, and Catholics got upset because they said it was a mockery of the Lord's Supper, painting by Da Vinci, and this and that, and all the Catholics are sharing these pictures all over social media, complaining about it. And I just don't know how Christians have time for all these things. There's no time. And you can see how this becomes the determining factor in our culture. We can't think that Christianity is going to change the world and do good by simply throwing tantrums every time someone does something that doesn't please Christians in the world. As we sit on the couch watching television, sitting there saying, oh, I'm going to watch the Olympics today. I'm going to sit here and watch the opening ceremony of the Olympics. Is that really what we need to be doing? Is that really what should be done by Christians in the time that they've got? Outside of their spiritual life, outside of their occupational life, is that really what Christians should be doing? Because I don't think this outrage culture will ever not have material to be outraged by or insulted by or offended by, because you're Christians going to the works of unbelievers and then being angry that the works of unbelievers are not flattering to Christians. I just don't understand how that's reasonable. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. You can choose to have that as your culture, but I don't think that that's real Christian culture. It's not positive Christian culture. And there's so much to study. You could be studying sacred scripture. You could be reading the church fathers. You could be studying history or philosophy or the history of art or music. You could be learning to sing or play the organ. So many valuable things you could be learning. And the things that end up on the schedule, I just believe we've got balls in the container that should not be in our container, and that's the problem. And so my challenge is for Christians to consider their time and energy, not even necessarily money, as much as time and energy, and ask, if I think of my time and energy as a container that's limited and only so many things can fit in it, what do I have in that container? And what do I not have in that container that really needs to be in that container? Because that's the challenge. So put those two things together, the need to choose our interests and pursuits carefully, and to think about gaining wisdom and becoming valuable as old wise men over decades and decades of our lives. I think that's the beginning of a real cultural renewal that Catholic men need to make. What are we actually going to be good at? What are we actually going to know when we're 70 years old? What are we going to be able to talk about when we're 70 years old with our grandchildren or with the younger generation, even in our parish, young families, people getting started in business and in the Christian life? What are we going to be able to share with them, teach them, talk with them about? What kind of sources are we going to be able to draw wisdom from if they ask us for some advice or help? Those are things we need to think of today, because how we use our time and energy over the next 30 years is going to determine what we can share when we're older. Our bodies are going to break down all of this nonsense with endless exercising and body sculpting and all of the sports and all of this stuff, all of that's going to be over. All of that's going to be over. We're going to be left with weak, fragile bodies that may be sick, may be filled with pains, may be unable to move much. But we'll still have, God willing, we'll still have our minds. We'll be able to offer counsel, wisdom. We should have prudence. We should have great knowledge to share with people, even when our bodies are no longer useful. And we've got to make those decisions now to store up that treasure, to be able to share it later in our lives. And so when we look at all of the studies in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, it's just overwhelming. Just to consider the study of history simply, it's just overwhelming. Thousands of pages of history. We think about philosophy, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. We look at the sacred scripture, thousands of pages. We look at the catechism, thousands of articles in the catechism. The volume of content is just so great. And the question is, how do we actually study this stuff? And the key, I believe, is we have to learn to study in layers over time. We've got to learn to be realistic. We've got to ask, what is the goal of my study? What is the goal of my study? And how should I study in order to achieve that goal? How should I study to achieve that goal? The goal, I argue, should be to be wise old men. That should be our goal, to be wise old men, to be a wise 70, 80-year-old man. That should be our goal. And so then when we think about our studies, we say, okay, so if that's my goal is to be wise when I'm 80 years old. How should I study? And the answer is we should study in layers, in cycles. We should study in cycles. And I'd like to talk about what that means. And let's start with a topic like philosophy. And I've explained this before, so if you listen to talks regularly, you'll know that I've addressed this before, but it's important and it needs to be repeated. We need to study in cycles or in layers because there's so much to study. And there's one principle of reading the scriptures, which, if we think about the scriptures and start reading the scriptures, we ask, well, how can I know how to interpret or understand things I read in the scriptures? And one of the simplest rules is the scripture is interpreted by other passages of scripture. So when you're first starting and you're reading things, you're sort of reading, in the middle of the ocean, as it were. You have nothing to compare this with or that with. It's hard to understand passages of scripture when it's the only thing you have read and you're reading with really no context. So the key is to just read, to gain that familiarity, to become familiar with all the passages of scripture. And then as you recycle through the scriptures, the second time you read a passage, you now read it in light of all of the Bible. At least you're familiar with all of the Bible. And so the second time you read through, you're now reading with more context. And so you read through the second time with a little more context, and you understand more. And then you start a third reading, and you read through a third time with more context. And you continue that cyclical study for the rest of your life. And so we just read as a discipline. We read through the scriptures. We don't sit there and plant ourselves at Genesis 1 and say, okay, I'm going to study to master Genesis chapter 1. No, that's not how it works. We simply read through the entire body of sacred scripture and prepare ourselves for our second readings. And we then make our second readings and prepare ourselves for our third readings and continue on, year by year by year, until we're old. And again, the goal is that when I'm 80 years old and someone asks me a question about the scriptures, I will be a man who has read through the entire body of sacred scripture 30, 40, 50, 60 times in the course of my adult years. And I can not only talk about or comment on a particular passage, but I can also think of other passages that address the same issue, explain the issue in more detail, clarify the context, provide an interpretation, and so on. And that's the value of that cyclical study, studying in layers, surveying the whole body of content, then starting again and going over it a second time and a third time, and repeating that as many times as we can before we finally run out of time. That method of cyclical study is not just for sacred scripture, it's for everything. That's how everything should be studied. That's how every subject should be studied. That's how history should be studied. That's how grammar should be studied. That's how philosophy should be studied. Every subject should be studied like that. We have to first survey the content and then recycle and recycle and recycle and recycle, gaining more and more mastery of the entire body of content every time we cycle through. And that takes some discipline because, for example, I just read a chapter in a book on art history in the academy. And I don't know much about art history. In fact, I know very little about art history, and I'm talking even prehistoric art. That was the subject of the first lesson I was reading. And as I'm going through it, there are just tons of ideas, words, place names that I'm not familiar with. And yet I'm making a first reading. So I could plant myself at this first reading and say, I'm going to read this and I'm going to look up every single word. I'm going to make sure I understand every single sentence, every single detail, and I'll spend days and days, if not weeks, on just the first chapter. And I can't guarantee, it's like taking out a loan. I can't guarantee that next month or next year I'll have the same kind of time that I have now. So I may never finish an in-depth study like that. And so I've got to learn to discipline myself to say, look, we don't understand everything in this chapter, but the goal is not to master this chapter on the first reading. The goal is to become familiar with this new content, to read through the whole text, to read through the whole book, to gain a first layer knowledge of this subject, and then to do it again, and to read through it a second time, and a third time, and to continue doing that as many times as God permits. And so it takes discipline both to physically read through all of the content, and also it takes mental discipline to stop yourself when you're tempted to deep dive and try to master every detail, because that's simply not the goal. And so you've got to learn how to study in this way, studying for the present, but also leaving room for the future. Because remember, when there's so much content to be learned, the only hope that we have two important things we have to do to learn it. First, we have to make good use of our time now, every day. We have to make good use of our time. And secondly, we have to continue to do so for an extended period of time. So we've got to discipline ourselves to get through the reading from front to back, to learn as much as we can reasonably with each layer, and then give ourselves time to continually cycle through the content. And again, this is true of every subject. Now, I often teach this with respect to Aristotle's philosophy, because when we read Aristotle, it becomes clear that this is how wise men study. And the reason why I say that is because when we read Aristotle, we'll start, and we know there's a chronological order in the works of Aristotle. Not just chronological in when they were composed, but there's an order of ideas where this is generally to be studied before that. For example, ethics is going to be studied before physics. Logic should be studied before any philosophy, because it's the instrument by which we actually investigate philosophy, and so on. Grammar comes before rhetoric, on and on. So there's an order, but when you read Aristotle, you realize that as you're reading, let's say, the categories, he makes references to the topics, which is a more advanced text. Now, obviously, no one who would be studying the categories, which is an introductory logical text, would have studied topics if they were studying every chapter for mastery. No one reading the categories would know the topics, but what it shows us is that it's expected that we're cycling through the works. So even though we're reading the categories, which is the first book of Aristotle's works on logic, we're going to have references to the topics, which is the second to last book of Aristotle's works on logic. And as we cycle through the books, when we read through the categories the second time, we'll understand what he's talking about when he refers to the topics in the study of the categories, because we're cycling back through. And we're going to continue to do that multiple times. And we're going to understand more and more and more each time we cycle through. So I really became conscious of that method of study simply by a necessary conclusion drawn as I read and studied the works of Aristotle. But it applies to all subjects. And so what that leads us to is, first of all, understanding what the books are that need to be studied. Solomon in Ecclesiastes says, of the writing of books there is no end. There's no end to the making of books. And yet Solomon says, the words of the wise are like goads. They all come from one shepherd. The words of the wise. And then he says, besides these, seek no more. And so we're counseled by wise Solomon that the making of books will never end, and that we should content ourselves, we should restrict ourselves to the words of the wise. And so we've got to have something of a canon of books that are to be our constant focus in studying, and really in putting together the Classical Liberal Arts Academy curriculum. That's what I've sought to do. I've sought to establish that canon, that library of the words of the wise, which ought to be the focus of our studies, starting when we're school children and continuing throughout our lives. And I intend for the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to be a place of study for students of all ages, from the earliest years of kindergarten all the way up through the last years of their life. That's what I intend the academy to be. And so that's the work that I'm doing. So I invite you to go through the curriculum, go through the course catalog on the Academy Study Center, go through the catalog on the main Academy website, and simply look at the topics, look at the works that are studied, look at the subjects that are studied, read about the curriculum so you can learn about the order in which the books ought to be studied, and then think of how you can devote yourself to studying those works for the rest of your life, just cycling through them. Now, what's comforting about this is that you don't have this pressure of mastery. And I think this comes from schooling, because when we're in school, let's say when we're in college, if you're a student who takes grades seriously, like I'm a straight A student, so when I start a course, I'm stressed because I need to master the content. I want to make full use of every opportunity I get to study. I want perfect scores on my essays and exams. And so I go into a study with a lot of stress, with high standards that I set on myself. And the problem with that's fine for college studies, because a college study lasts 16 weeks and you're done. But for real life studies, that's just not realistic. You can't work with that level of intensity, because what will happen is you'll just burn out, or there will be days where you just don't have that kind of energy, that kind of zeal, and knowing that you don't have that kind of zeal, you'll end up not studying at all. It's like exercise. If you go out and you say, every single time I exercise, I'm going to try to set my personal best every single time I exercise, what will happen is that the first day that you don't have all that energy, you're gonna get depressed and frustrated and say, forget it. I'm not going to be able to beat my personal best. I'm not going to be able to beat yesterday's time or last week's time, so why bother? And that becomes an excuse, this sort of perfectionist spirit. Whereas, for example, when I exercise, I go out and say, my goal today for my physical exercise, my goal is to walk 3 miles. That's my goal. My goal today is to walk 3 miles, and that's easy. I can walk at a very comfortable pace and take 45, 50 minutes and walk 3 miles without even breathing heavy and say, good, I got 3 miles of exercise today. That was my goal. That's what I was hoping to do. And then I can say to myself, anything that I want to do, anything I feel motivated to do above and beyond that, if I want to jog, if I want to run, if I want to do something extra, that's all optional. And I'm never going to consider that my goal. So it's good for me to do more. But tomorrow, when it's time to exercise, I tell myself, we're going to go walk 3 miles. That's the goal. And that allows for consistent daily exercise to be sustained. The same thing is necessary in studies. If we go into study saying, I'm going to study this lesson so that I can basically repeat it verbatim as if I was going to take an exam on this content, that's great. That's great, but you won't do that every day. And if you put that kind of pressure and set that kind of standard, you're going to end up just not studying. And that's what's actually wrong with that. It's not prudent to do that. And so we should simply say, look, I've got an hour to study. I'm going to physically put my finger on the page and move my finger across the page, one line at a time, for the next 30 minutes. And that's my goal. My goal is to simply read the text for 30 minutes that I have available. And when I say read, as I said, physically put your finger on the book and move your finger across the page and physically read the book for a set amount of time, and set that as your goal. You could say, I'm going to read, for 30 minutes, I'm going to read the sacred scriptures. And again, put your finger on the page, move your finger line by line through the text, physically reading the text, not trying to memorize, not trying to master all the content, just becoming familiar with all the content of the reading. And again, using your finger as a guide, as sort of a pendulum that just ticks and tocks through the scheduled time. Physically reading the text, and make the best use of time that you can. Simply reading and reading and reading. I'm not talking now about any kind of devotional reading like Lectio Divina or anything like that. I'm talking about academic reading for the sake of just cycling through the writings of the wise, cycling through Aristotle, cycling through the Summa Theologica, the sacred scriptures, the catechism, world history, any subject that should be studied, just learning to cycle through it physically reading through the works, moving through the works one layer at a time, having that kind of a discipline, making study a physical activity. That's very pleasant. There's no pressure. There's no goal that's not attainable. It's a simple, pleasant, positive activity, our studies. And that's how they should be designed. And if you study like that, you'll be able to study consistently, day by day by day. You'll even look forward to it. For example, when I first was learning to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, I really didn't like it. I just found it to be sort of chaotic and disconnected, and I would read through, my mind would wander all over the place. I'd get to the end of the Psalms and say, like, I don't get anything out of that. Like, I don't even know what I just read. And I went through this for a while, and I just kept telling myself, like, this is what the church gives us. God will bless it. You've just got to learn to appreciate it by continuing to do it. But after a while, I started to just chant the offices, just literally, sometimes just monotone, chanting through the Psalms and through the prayers and through the readings and so on, just chanting monotone. And just by making it musical, by making it pleasant, I began to enjoy it. And now that sort of humming or rhythm of chanting of the Liturgy of the Hours is like a soothing, comforting part of my day. And so sometimes we just have to do it and do it in a way that makes it pleasant, and that's actually what makes it sustainable and something we look forward to rather than something we dread. So it's a difficult mind game to play, that in order to accomplish more, we're going to actually lower our standards. We're going to lower our standards so that we can do it more consistently over a long period of time, and trust that the greatest output, the greatest result will come as a result of sustained daily studies over a long period of time. And so by lowering our standards, by making the studies more pleasant, by making the goals more easily attainable, we actually make our studies something that is enjoyable, that we can continue day by day for a long period of time, because that's how we're actually going to make the most progress. And that takes some discipline. It's almost like counterintuitive, lowering the standards to raise the standards, but that's what's necessary. So we've got our daily spiritual life to live, and our spiritual duties, the work of God, as it were, and we've got our temporal duties to take care of, the work of man, as it were. And in the time that's left over, that time needs to be time that we devote to study, to pursue wisdom and knowledge. And we've got to learn how to use that time, how to study in a way that's pleasant and sustainable for decades and decades and decades, because we've got to read through thousands and thousands of pages of content, layer by layer by layer. And this is the only way to do that. So what I'd like to encourage Catholic men to consider is, rather than having time watching videos or sports or just, going through social media or getting entangled in the headlines of the news and politics and this and that or that, I'd like to challenge Catholic men to say, I want to be an old, wise man. And in order for me to be an old, wise man, I need to study the writings of the wise. My grandkids, my great-grandkids, young people who will be living when I'm an old man, will not benefit by me having known all of the daily headlines on the news or the events on social media or the latest results in sports or the Olympics. They won't care if I know popular culture. They won't care if I can name every kind of car. They won't care if I know all the athletes' statistics and so on. What would be really valuable is if I knew the sacred scriptures. What would be really valuable is if I was a master of the catechism of the Catholic Church. What would be really valuable is if I knew the Summa Theologica, if I knew Aristotle's Ethics, if I knew and so on. through the writings and works of wise men. That's really what I think we need to commit to. That's the culture that's missing today. When I think of the study of history, because I was a history major as an undergrad, and I continue to study history today at Harvard, and as I go through my history studies, I've been reading and reading and reading since I was 19 years old. And I remember when I was in college, I would have just 50 pages a night to read, and I had to learn how to read voluminously like that. And it takes discipline. It takes a quietness of mind. It takes a persevering spirit to actually sit and see what needs to be read as work that needs to be done. You know, when I used to work in the gardens, and we had acres of gardens on the farm, there would be days where I would go outside and say, you know, I've got to hoe 20 rows of corn, and this is going to take all my effort all day long. And you just get started hoeing and hoeing and hoeing, and 30 minutes goes by, and you realize, like, I have to do this for hours and hours and hours, and you learn this quiet, steady discipline of just working one strike of the hoe at a time, multiplied by thousands and thousands and thousands of strikes until finally you're done. And there's this sense of completion with this sense of exhaustion, which makes the work so respectable, because you realize just how much toil it takes to get through that work, to actually finish it, and to finish it well. But that becomes a very valuable experience to learn what it feels like to persevere through a work task. And we've got to learn that study, reading especially, reading is a work task. It's just like hoeing a field of corn, like weeding rows and rows of garden plants. It's something that has to get done. And the only way to get it done is to get it done. And this is the concept of grinding, learning to just press on and press on and press on until the work is finished. And what we see in lazy society is an aversion to that, a refusal to do that, a willingness to get started and then to start fussing and whining that this is boring, that you'd like to do something else, that you really don't want to do this unless, tons of money or rewards are injected to keep you going. We've got to learn that discipline of looking at a task and saying, this is my work. I'm going to start this work, and I'm going to continue hoeing and hoeing and hoeing through it, one strike at a time, until the last stroke. And it takes that kind of discipline to be able to study, to be able to read, to be able to sit down and read 50 pages and just see it. Every line is like a row of corn that has to be worked through. And we just have to go and go and go from the beginning to the end. It's work. It's physical work. It's mental discipline. And it's actually a toughness, a mental toughness that's needed to study. Study is not something for the weak. It's not something for soft-bodied, soft-minded men. It's a discipline. It's difficult. It takes perseverance. It takes self-control to sit there and to read every line from the beginning of the chapter to the end, and to do that consistently day after day after day for years and years and years, because that's the only way that we're going to make significant progress in our studies. So I'd like to challenge men to make study their leisure culture. And even in leisure doesn't mean laziness. It doesn't mean laying around, playing video games. Leisure simply means activity outside of our temporal responsibilities, our temporal work, what we do with the rest of our time. I'd like to challenge Catholic men to learn to use that time for study, learn to use that time to read and work through important texts in philosophy, in history, in theology, in the sacred scriptures, and so on. And go to bed every night exhausted physically and mentally. And lay down in your bed, put your head on your pillow, and just feel that exhaustion of a day well spent. Because if we can live like that and repeat that 365 days a year for 20, 30, 40 years, there will be some wise old Catholic men in the world, and the future generations need us to do that. And I hope we can do that. I hope that's helpful. God bless.